Looking back, I am just not that happy with it. The formula for the series was still underdeveloped, and I tried covering history from 1775 until the modern day, which was just way too much time, and led to me ignoring most of the butterfly effects. Thus, today I seek to improve on that video, in the same way that I would divide up other nations in this series between various eras of their history or various government forms. It makes sense to do the same for the US. That way, rather than focusing on 250 years of history, I can just do multiple videos arguing how the US could have done best in each of those eras individually. Today, we focus specifically on the founding of the state, the Revolutionary War, roughly up to somewhere in the 1820s. Just how much bigger than this can we realistically get the US by this point? If you have seen last week's video about the territorial goals of the American Revolutionary War, you might have a decent idea on how I plan to accomplish this. But to summarize, it is important to remember the Revolutionary War was more than just North America, as France and Spain had far-reaching ambitions on British territories across the globe. In our timeline, while the British did lose the Revolutionary War, they barely lost anything in the other theaters, with Spain and France accomplishing very little of their own goals. Britain would remain a global hegemon on the seas, and they would remain powerful even within the Americas. Today, we seek to explore a world where Britain faces a more decisive loss, importantly in North America, but really across the world, ensuring Britain is not in a position to contest the United States into the future. But how do we accomplish this? Well, there are two things which we need to change. First, the US needs to get Canada, whether through a military conquest or perhaps better, by convincing them to join the Continental Congress. Second, we need a coalition to achieve a decisive naval victory, thereby ensuring that Britain is forced into a more drastic peace deal, ensuring they cannot, as in our timeline, continue to contest American power and independence afterwards, thereby freeing up the United States for whatever foreign policy they choose to pursue. Now, accomplishing this might be easier than you think, or at least it's far less unrealistic than you might think for France to gain a naval advantage. We like to think of the British as these unstoppable naval hegemons, and true, they eventually came out ahead in this war. But in terms of pure naval power, France was not that far behind at the start of this conflict, and together with Spain, the coalition had about 1.5 times Britain's naval power. A partial reason for this was the prior 7 Years' War. Britain, in victory, had destroyed quite some French ships, and France and Spain invested heavily to rebuild a newer, better navy, making the continental power ships generally more modern than their British counterparts. Especially since Britain was in heavy debt after this and defunded their navy to save some cash. France also had a very crucial advantage in positioning, as they could threaten a naval invasion of Britain at home, forcing them to keep ships back, while in the meantime other ships could threaten Britain's colonial empire. In terms of actual naval size, French estimates during the war, which admittedly might have overstated French power a bit, put the amount of total guns at 130,000 to 110,000. It truly would not have been unreasonable to suggest that a moderately worse-led Britain could have seen the naval front swing even more in France's favor after a few lucky victories. Then we get Canada, where we broadly have two options. First, try to have the colonized areas join the American Revolution. Second, have the Americans succeed in a military takeover. Both of these have their benefits and drawbacks. In terms of getting Canada to join, the problem is that they just lacked the broad-scale revolts against British rule. Population figures up north were also way smaller than even the smallest colonies within New England, with Connecticut having a larger population than all of Canada. This made it far easier for the British to clamp down on the minor revolts that did occur, especially in Nova Scotia. Truly, Canada just lacked the population to fuel such an outright revolution. But large-scale American conquests, at least early on in the war, while not impossible, were difficult, as the Continental Army was weak, militia-based, and not yet the European-backed, competently trained fighting force it would later become, while they would have to fight a professional British army and Quebecois and Loyalist resistance. Thus, I suggest compromise. Specifically, I'd like to focus on Quebec. In 1775, Quebec is by far the most important territory within British Canada. Their population way outpaces the others, but also Quebec controls the St. Lawrence River leading into the Great Lakes, a primary route for British-Canadian commerce and troop movements. If America could secure this river, it would become significantly easier to mop up Western Canada. So, I would like to go back to 1774. In that year, the Quebec Act was passed. This act was rather major, and as you may have noticed, it passed only a year before the revolution began historically. To understand the act, we look towards the 7 Years' War, where Britain took control over the region. The, for now loyal, 13 colonies had assumed that this British victory would open up all this land out west to their settlement. Instead, Britain, seeking to avoid conflict, proclaimed native reserves and restricted the colonists to the eastern coast. This was considered an insult, causing tensions between the empire and its colonies. But Quebec at this time was only this part of Canada. The 1774 Quebec Act expanded it to all of this. Once more, this greatly upset the 13 colonies, as the Quebecois were Catholic, while Britain and the colonies were Protestant. Especially as Quebec also got certain autonomies and religious tolerance, this deal further incited colonial dissatisfaction with British rule, as in the minds of the 13 colonies, they were now being surrounded by natives and Catholics, and thus they were betrayed by their own British government, who should rightfully have been on their side. But this Quebec Act, aside from angering the colonists, also ensured that when the American colonies continually appealed for the Quebecois to join the revolution, as, now that they were fighting the British, their Catholicism suddenly wasn't an issue, they found the Quebecois were absolutely uninterested and remained loyal to London. After all, why would you risk war when your way of life and autonomy is already guaranteed? But since Britain only passed this act in 1774, a year before the revolution, it wouldn't be crazy to suggest it being delayed. The reason the British even passed it during this period at all was because they were anticipating unrest in the 13 colonies. With such a short time frame between the events, what if Britain is just a bit slower in implementing the acts, and at the time of the American Revolution, Quebec's status is still unclear? By then, it is not guaranteed, but it does become plausible that the Quebecois might actually dip their toes in revolution, sending delegations to the Continental Congress. This doesn't immediately ensure that all of Canada follows them, far from it, but it does cut the region into pieces, allowing the Americans to be on the offensive in the north. Then, as the US starts grappling with the British, we introduce the French and the Spanish into the war as well. If we want to, we could get them to execute their most radical plans, a direct invasion of either southern England or Ireland, with many in the French government assuming that they could incite an Irish revolt similar to that seen in North America. Of course, either of these, if successful, could completely devastate the British war effort, as even if they managed to successfully push out these invasions, it is doubtful they would have the spare resources to continue to defend their colonies. But we won't do either of these invasions. Both would quite stretch the realism of this scenario. Naval invasions across history were extremely difficult, and Britain had plenty of soldiers on standby during this war. Besides, to even attempt such an invasion, the British Navy would need to be near destroyed. And even then, it is more likely Britain simply attempts to negotiate after such naval losses than wait for a full defeat. So, rather than all-out victory, let's focus in on a couple of battles. For example, the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, which ensured Britain couldn't reinforce Yorktown and essentially won the Americans the war, only saw one British ship lost. The French Navy then moved to the Caribbean, where they fought the Battle of the Saints, a crucial naval battle in which Britain won a victory, capturing 4 French ships of the line and destroying another, in the process devastating French hopes for further Caribbean conquest. It is not crazy to suggest more decisive French victories here, putting Britain in an uncomfortable position regarding the Caribbean and home defense, at a time when it was becoming very clear that the North American War was lost too. To put the importance of the Caribbean into context, economically speaking, just the island of Jamaica was about as valuable to the British economy as the entire 13 colonies. The plantations of the Caribbean being under such heavy threat could be more than enough to force Britain into making a more severe treaty than historically. We might, for example, assume that Spain manages to reconquer the minor but strategic chokeholds of Minorca and Gibraltar, while in the Caribbean, some of the minor islands might fall to France, but more notably, the fall of Jamaica puts enormous pressure on the British economy. Perhaps France even succeeds in negotiating a return to southern India, maybe in exchange for the coalition taking less of the Caribbean. It is important to note though, that even though France is winning, they cannot keep pressing for too much, as they too are reaching bankruptcy due to this war. Now most important then is the US, which too is in a stronger position during peace negotiations. With Quebec already a state, we could expect the isolated eastern provinces of Canada to fall too. Then, at least all of the territory the US got historically could be seized, likely increased with at least all of Greater Quebec. It is possible Britain attempts to keep some territories, like the Hudson Bay, Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, but I think it is more likely that, seeing their broad collapse on the continent and the prospect of renewed competition with France and Spain, Britain prefers abandoning most of the continent, hoping this allows for better relations with the new state post-war, as trying to keep these impossible to defend, disconnected territories would do little but set up for a difficult to win second war, that would likely lead to the fall of those territories anyways. Thus, something like this could very well be the post-war map, a significant upgrade over our timeline. And by this point, the changes are going to start compounding, not just for the US. The economic value of all the colonies Britain might have just lost is immense. About 50% of British exports and about 30% of British imports came from these American colonies. Also, while we like to focus on the French financial situation after the war, for understandable reasons, Britain too had taken significant loans during these conflicts, reaching about 150% debt to GDP. What saved Britain historically was having a more responsible government, a more efficient taxation system, and very lucrative colonies to deal with this debt. In this alternate timeline, Britain would struggle far more to come back from their position, which is going to be very important for the coming period of conflict. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now the reason I found it necessary to focus on British naval defeats as well, rather than just focusing on Canada, is because, as you will know, soon after the American Revolution came the French Revolution. Even with the colonial gains France might have made in this conflict, there were only 6 years between the end of the war and French Revolution. These new colonies are just not profitable enough to stabilize the French treasury in such a short time frame, especially as bad weather in 1788 caused a famine in the nation. During the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Britain always remained France's greatest enemy. With them crippled, Napoleon will have a far easier time dominating the continent, potentially even opening the door to Napoleon achieving a naval victory over the British, thereby securing British neutrality as France overruns the continent, or potentially even a Napoleonic invasion of the British Isles. Worst case, France does still lose the war, but the US gets decades to do whatever it wants in the Americas. Best case, Napoleon wins in Europe, and the US can do whatever it wants in the Americas. Thus, there are three reasons why I think Napoleon is so important for this timeline. First, he keeps Britain busy, meaning that even if we assume Britain didn't give up on all of Canada, this would be the time for the Americans to strike. Second, Napoleon historically regained the Louisiana territory from Spain and then sold it to the Americans, nearly doubling the size of the states. Finally, he launched an invasion of Spain, putting that nation in turmoil and facilitating the Latin American Wars of Independence. As you might imagine, such Spanish weakness might provide immense opportunity for the Americans now that there is nobody to hold them back. Now it's important to note that when Napoleon invaded Spain, there were initially two camps within the colonies. Those who preferred the absolutist status quo, and those who wanted to reform the system now that Spain itself was weakened. Initially, both sides supported Ferdinand VII as their rightful monarch. Neither recognized Joseph, Napoleon's puppet king. Even if Napoleon somehow successfully conquered all of Spain, that does not mean that the colonies would switch to his side too. This means that the Spanish Empire is in crisis without solid leadership, while soon independence revolts would be rocking the Americas too. Britain is too weak and distracted with fighting France, and France itself has already given up on American empire due to the Haitian Revolution, and as such has sold Louisiana territory to the Americans. For all intents and purposes, Napoleon has essentially severed most of the ties between Europe and the Americas, and it is difficult to imagine better timing than this for a war with Spain. Now that doesn't mean that it has to become a war, but some Americans, including President Thomas Jefferson, considered the Louisiana Purchase to include territory all the way to the Rio Grande, as well as western Florida, thus arguing the border should look like this. Of course, this claim was false. France never controlled any of that territory, so obviously it would be impossible for them to sell the territory. But such things don't really matter considering the position that Spain is in. So it is possible war might be avoided once the Americans start putting pressure and the Spanish feel forced to concede. In such a case, Spain might give up Florida and some of the western territories, and the US is for now satisfied and doesn't escalate to a full war. But if Spain doesn't negotiate and doesn't concede, we may well see a US invasion. The American army is weak and small, but the Spanish army is smaller and increasingly distracted by simultaneous revolts across their colonies. Besides, a lot of the territory the US is invading is still under native control, with Spanish influence going little further than a few forts and flags. If the US gets really ambitious, they might even try gearing up the American Navy for an invasion of Cuba, which is a very strategic and valuable island to control. If we assume that this war goes well, Spain eventually reaches out to negotiate, or reaches a point where their North American territories just collapse. The US can then try to find a new border. Some might suggest going as far as the annexation of New Spain, which, territorially, would obviously be a massive deal. But this would be a very bad idea, likely to die in Congress. At this point in history, Mexico had about the same population as the US. So even if the Mexicans voluntarily asked to join the US, this would practically turn the states into a majority Catholic Hispanic state, which undoubtedly the politicians of the time are not interested in. So what the US does take is difficult to say. In case of a short war, Florida and the Texas territory might be all, with a border deal then signed with the new Mexican state, and the US could look something like this by the 1820s, compared to this in our timeline. Alternatively, the most comprehensive victory I might imagine includes targets in the Caribbean being targeted, mainly Cuba, but if under Spanish control, even Jamaica and Puerto Rico could be seized. In the West, what exactly the US takes is also difficult to predict, but they very well could try to reach the Pacific Ocean during this war. Specifically, borders during this time were often based on rivers, with the Rio Grande already being followed in the south. In our timeline, John Quincy Adams had sought the Colorado as a second river to follow, which feels like a very natural goal for the US to pursue, which would make the US look like this. I know, it looks like complete border gore, but it is the most concrete historical proposal we have. Beyond these territorial gains, the US would obviously back Mexican independence as well. By now, we have covered most of the early expansion of the US, and they are so significantly larger than in our timeline, and we are still only around the 1820s. Of course, the Oregon Territory, in our timeline contested by Britain and eventually split, in this timeline goes to the US unopposed, aside from rubbing against the minor colony of Russian America. Truly, American hegemony over the entire continent is already a fact of life. Let's now then start thinking a bit about the internal politics of this new state. For one, with Catholic Quebec having joined the Union at the start, how does that work? Are Protestant-Catholic relations within the Union better, or does this Catholic French Quebec become an ugly duckling, disliked and distrusted by the others? It is very possible Quebec forces a lot more debate in the Supreme Courts and the Constitutional Convention over states' rights. For example, it is very possible Quebec attempts to harden their own borders to prevent Anglo-Protestants from overrunning their state. Whether or not they get their way could greatly increase state autonomy within the United States. Thus, that leaves two broad outcomes for Quebec. Either they remain an odd bastion of French Catholicism in a sea of Protestants, or they simply get swallowed whole by the Anglo behemoth around them, unable to compete with the population difference to the rest of the United States. Then, we obviously need to discuss slavery within the United States, and I cannot state enough that, optimally, I'd want to say that the institution just gets abolished peacefully. Sadly, I feel that, once more, this stretches the realism of this scenario. Even though in our timeline, many of the northern states started a process of gradual abolition, it is difficult to imagine such a movement catching on in the south or nationwide. The difference between the regions is just too great. The southern economy is too reliant on the institution, but perhaps even more importantly, the difference in the percentage of enslaved peoples is so large and racism so normalized, it would be naive to suggest that the South simply realizes the error of their ways. For such a thing to work, we'd likely need to go earlier back in time and weaken the institution far earlier, as I struggle to find a realistic point of departure after 1775. Now you might ask, but don't the Canadian states swing the balance of power in the Union against slavery? But again, I will remind you just how few people live in Canada. And besides, the South would likewise have new territories to create slave states in. And an island like Cuba alone has more people than all of Canada. There is also Texas, which in our timeline, due to its temporary status of independent nation, has become an absolutely massive state. In this timeline, it is far more likely they would be divided into several more normal-sized states, thereby easily making up for the Canadian senators we have added. In total, I therefore don't expect a radical change in power between the free and slave states. And if anything, sadly, the slave states might actually benefit more in the short term. Now that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. Even if we can't abolish the institution fully early on, something like Washington personally freeing its slaves could send a powerful message. Alternatively, there were amendments considered which protected slavery in existing states but would forbid further expansion. I don't really like that route though, as it would give far too much legitimacy to this vile institution. Other common suggestions are the cotton gin never being invented, which made cotton far more profitable and allegedly gave slavery a boost in the US. This, however, is both difficult to accomplish, as the gin was a rather simple concept, but it also overstates its importance, as there were several other valuable cash crops even before cotton. In terms of an early, peaceful end to slavery, perhaps the most realistic route is for the founding fathers to do something like grandfathering in an end date on the legality of slavery, perhaps somewhere in the 1830s to 1850, thereby placating current slaveholders in the early US while putting pressure on any future slaveholders. Alternatively, we might simply concede that we might need a civil war, in which we root for the North to swiftly crush the South, totally delegitimizing the institution and hopefully leading to a more successful Reconstruction era than we saw historically. As we come near the end of this scenario, we can check back at Europe. The Napoleonic Wars will have put the continent in chaos for decades, but eventually it will end, either through an eventual Napoleonic victory or an eventual victory for the coalition. Neither of these outcomes particularly matter for the US, as either way, Europe would now be incapable of interfering with the North American hegemon, especially if the US has indeed seized the Spanish Caribbean colonies. Both Britain and France would feel the pressure to remain on good terms with the young state, to ensure the remaining colonies are not put under threat. Still, we mustn't yet overstate American power during this time. This continental-sized power would, by 1820, have about 11 million people, roughly equal to Britain and smaller than France's 27. Similarly, Britain would still hold the early advantage in industry, and the European navies would, on the oceans, still be more powerful. Yet, the near unbeatable advantages the US holds are its near untouchability, as even with naval superiority, the Europeans would struggle to land anywhere. There is also their economic value, as they hold near monopolies over a number of very valuable goods. And of course, there is also the sheer potential emanating from the state, as more and more European immigrants start arriving to fill up the nation. Truly, splendid isolationism has never been so easy. The US barely even needs an army or a powerful navy, as it knows very well that circumstance makes them near uninvadable, and their economic power ensures the Europeans likely aren't even interested in trying. Around here is where I end this scenario. The American rise to power from upstart colonies to masters of a continent over the time span of roughly 50 years is insane, but really not implausible. Already by this point, this alternate US would be the fourth largest empire in history, only rivaled by the Mongols, the British, whose empire is plausibly butterflied away, and the Russians. But of course, it's important to note that the Americans are just getting started. I won't continue this scenario in detail, but it should be obvious the directions where they can still expand into. Mexico would hardly be in a position to resist another American invasion, and later partition. It would even be possible, as suggested even in our own timeline, that eventually this alternate US just annexed all of Mexico. Still, for the same reason that the US didn't in our timeline, not wanting to deal with the large, likely unruly Mexican population, this is far from guaranteed. In Latin America, historically, it were the British who took on a hegemonic role in trade and geopolitics. With Britain weakened, or potentially even subservient to France, it is very possible the US now takes on a bigger role earlier on. Other obvious potential routes for expansion are the near guaranteed annexation of Alaska, whether through sale or through conquest, the potential purchase of Greenland, but only if Denmark consents, and a variety of expansion options into Central America and the Caribbean, which we also saw in our timeline, like filibusters trying to conquer states in the region, or El Salvador requesting statehood, or the Dominican Republic requesting annexation. Of course, bigger is not always better, and it will be up to the alternate political sphere of the nation to decide whether or not to pursue any of these expansion options. But the point is, the options lay open for the US, and really, there is nobody who can stop them if they try to pursue them. Quite possibly, if we do assume the issue of slavery couldn't be solved earlier on and peacefully, anything like an alternate civil war might be the final point where American hegemony can be stopped. Of course, I would easily put my money on this alternate North defeating this alternate South. But if the Europeans do decide to intervene in this alternate timeline, then a decisive intervention to ensure the continent is again split could prove disastrous. More than likely though, the US will survive such a crisis and be better off for it. With this most important political hurdle solved, and European immigration exploding yet further, the state becoming a center of industrialization, it is now only a matter of time before the US decisively becomes the most powerful nation the world has ever seen.